In Part 9, Section 264 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discusses the influence that our ancestors, that our genetic inheritance will have on us, and he strikes here, I think, another Lamarckian note. That is, he gives expression again to what I've referred to as his Lamarckism, his adherence to a, I think, discredited 19th century view that acquired traits and knowledge are inheritable, can be passed down genetically from parents to children. He asserts here that the actions and habits of our ancestors will carry down into later generations. He writes quite explicitly, it is simply not possible that a human being should not have the qualities and preferences of his parents and ancestors in his body. This is the problem of race, he writes. Now, even allowing that by race he means something closer to what we might call nationality or ethnicity, tribe, this is a passage with some very ugly implications. Nietzsche does write about what he thinks are some of the main characteristics of the plebeian type of person, the corrupted blood, the certainty that one is correct. These, he thinks, mark a certain type of person, meaning not just a sort of psychological type, but also something of a natural biological type. Tying this in with his previous critiques of education, he does argue here that modern education is, in a popular sense, nothing more than a kind of inculcated self-deception about one's racial biological type. That is, education for plebeians now in modern democratic Europe is simply a matter of convincing plebeians that they are not plebeians. It is giving them a kind of false self-concept that they come from something other than and are something other than what they are. Overall, I think a fairly ugly section, and there's only so much one can do to try to save Nietzsche from the obvious terrible implications of what he's saying. In the following section, Nietzsche talks about the egoism of the noble soul. The noble soul is characterized by an unshakable faith that lower types of humanity are subordinate to it by nature. And one of the marks of nobility is the acceptance of this fact, this order of rank in the realm of the spirit and of nature, without any type of guilty conscience, any need for argument or explanation. The noble soul, he says, honors its equals not because it feels obligated or recognizes any kind of rule that it must follow, but because it sees in them the image of itself. And so in honoring them, it honors itself. Is a very important way in which it seems all praise given by the noble spirit is self-praise, refracted perhaps through a recognized peer or equal. The noble spirit does not look up, but rather forward. It knows itself to be at a spiritual height, says Nietzsche. There followed two very brief sections, a one-line quote from Goethe about giving respect to those who do not seek themselves, indicating, I think, those who already possess themselves. If one is seeking oneself, then one is somehow incomplete. And what he asserts to be a Chinese proverb about making your heart small, making your soul small. Self-diminution, Nietzsche says, is a characteristic of an exhausted and declining civilization. So perhaps China in a previous time, and in Nietzsche's own time, modern democratic Europe, and specifically Germany. In section 268, he takes up the question of what is common. Common here, meaning first, the opposite of noble, since this part 9 is about what is noble. What in the end is common? Nietzsche plays here on a verbal ambiguity, which is present in German as well as in English, where common can mean what is shared and what is widespread among many, and can also mean what is vulgar, what is low and base. So he begins by noting that simply understanding language for the purposes of social cooperation requires that we hold meaning in common, that we all agree upon and share a common understanding of words. From here, he moves on to say that it is the shared experiences of a group in struggling against its environment that forms a people, and a people is able to understand itself through its legacy of shared experiences more than outsiders, even if they all speak the same language. So this is the source of the social bond, the common, source of the social bond, also a source of friendship, having similar reactions and similar feelings. I could not be friends with someone who I thought had profoundly opposite emotional reactions to circumstances from my own. Furthermore, the dominant pattern of reactions within a group of people determines its order of rank. We might say an order of rank of individuals, the high and the low, and also the order of rank of its values, of its dominant drives. This is what gives the sort of national character to a group of people. But this fact of the common also gives the advantage to ordinary types of self, of personality, those who best and fastest grasp the average and common experiences of all people have a sort of advantage. We might say there's a sort of built-in evolutionary advantage to the mediocre and to the normal, to the common. So to be uncommon, to be noble, to be exceptional requires a countervailing force. It requires something that comes not from the common but from somewhere else, perhaps from within one's own sense of will and greatness or some natural gift, to overcome this sort of natural social drift towards the common and the advantages of the common. Section 269 is, I think, like some other sections late in Part 9, autobiographical as well as informative and observational. Nietzsche tells us about the psychologist and the chief danger of the modern psychologist, which is the phenomenon of pity. And I think he's talking here about himself as much as about the psychologist in general. So the psychologist, in looking into human character, needs, Nietzsche says, hardness and cheerfulness more than anyone else in the human race, because he is in constant danger of succumbing to pity. His knowledge of what man is, of what humanity is like, is in danger of overwhelming him. If he is overwhelmed by pity, he may turn against his own class, his own type of noble, higher spirit, and engage in a kind of self-destruction. Part of the therapy that the psychologist then imposes upon himself might be a kind of escape into the everyday activities, escape from his memory of what man is like. There's a way in which the psychologist acquires this knowledge at great price and at great suffering, and then the memory of the knowledge of what man is like is a sort of constant threat to his own mental health and mental stability. Nietzsche ends this section by discussing the way in which women and Christianity both are sources of danger for the psychologist and for the artist who looks into the human spirit and sees just what is there. Both of these are sources of pity and falsehood and ultimately the danger of self-destruction for the psychologist. The next 8 sections deal with, in different ways, with contrasts between noble and base characters. Nietzsche jumps around a little bit talking about different qualities that we find in the noble self. One of these is a capacity for profound suffering. The noble spirit is able to suffer as few others are able to. We might think of the contrast here with the last man, who is, we're told, unable even to despise himself, unable to suffer in any important way because his sense of self and his sense of what is important is so shallow. Because the noble spirit is capable of such great suffering, he wears a variety of disguises. He might wear the disguise of cheerfulness or of scientific objectivity or of folly. These are all masks, sometimes even double or triple masks, that the psychologist, the noble spirit, has to wear in public. Nietzsche also says that noble souls, on confronting each other, will respect the mask. They will not probe too deeply into another's deception, another's public persona. People who have read Kierkegaard might helpfully contrast this with Kierkegaard's idea of the knights of faith, who pass each other without recognition. Another characteristic of the noble soul is a sense of cleanliness, and I think this is meant spiritually more than physically. He says the loftiness of the saints is the spiritualization of this cleanliness instinct, this desire to overcome the kind of filth of humanity, to rise above it. The saint's pity, he writes, is pity with the dirt of what is human, all too human. So this desire to get away from or to overcome, to endure the stench of mankind. Another mark of the noble spirit is that he holds his duties to be personal rather than universal. He does not generalize his duties or his obligations. This even is a kind of temptation for the noble person that he resists, that he sees, because he knows his values to come from within himself, he does not fall prey to the desire to make his obligations the obligations of all people. He speaks solely in the first person, we might say, when he makes his moral judgments. The noble spirit is also the one who acts at the right time, in contrast with awaking too late. In fact, Nietzsche suggests that perhaps genius is common in the world, but timely genius is what's rare. For the noble spirit, there is a greater danger and a greater likelihood of ruin. He runs more risks. Again, the contrast with the last man is helpful. And the noble self may realize at the end of his life that he has learned something that he needed to know at the beginning. Nietzsche calls this the eternal, distasteful, too late, the sort of tragic recognition that one does not have. One has only lately acquired the knowledge that one really needed much earlier. There are some personal reflections towards the end of this section of Part 9. Nietzsche has a nice image where he speaks of the question of going back, and he says, well, one also goes back when one is preparing to take a huge leap. Some of these also, I think, these observations are also, I think, autobiographical. He speaks of the self-control of praising only people with whom you disagree, and how this then creates a certain kind of false expectation in the observers of the great man. And great thoughts, he says, are always understood last, like light from a distant star, like the light from a supernova that happened thousands of years ago, finally reaching us on Earth. This is, again, a sort of characteristic part of the ethos of the great man. In section 287, Nietzsche takes up explicitly the question of what is noble? What does the word noble mean now, today, in a plebeian age? And he plays a little bit off of the Christian distinction between acts and works, and he says it's not noble actions, it's not the works of nobility that constitute the noble person. Rather, it's something more like faith, some kind of inner certainty, inner quality of the noble soul. And he emphasizes this, a good formula for the nobility of soul. The noble soul has reverence for itself. It possesses itself in a way that makes it capable of holding itself, assigning itself that kind of importance. I might think here again of the passage from The Gay Science in which the madman says, we must become gods in order to be worthy of having brought about the death of God. Perhaps the noble spirit is the one who has successfully stepped into that empty, God-shaped hole in the cosmos, and who is now capable of feeling reverence for himself in some critical way that is not present in lower types of human self. In sections 289 and beyond, Nietzsche makes some interesting observations about philosophy, and I think this may provide us with a kind of interpretive key to some of his own work as we come to the end of this book. No philosopher, he says, ever writes his final philosophy in books. Okay, shades of Plato's seventh letter here. Or, as he puts it, beyond every cave there is a still deeper cave, perhaps again invoking Plato. Every philosophy is a foreground philosophy. Every philosophy also conceals a philosophy. So the suggestion, I think, here for us, coming towards the end of Beyond Good and Evil, is that there's a great deal more to Nietzsche's thought than what is present here in the book. What we have here is only a starting point, a place for further exploration. The great thinkers of the world always fear being misunderstood, but they perhaps even more so fear being understood, because the former will sting their vanity, but the latter will sting their heart. To be understood is to share one's own suffering, the suffering that one's knowledge brings with others. So this brings us to the end of section 292. The next video will look at section 293. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.